Seems like we have no new faces today. So moving on to outstanding RFCs. Let me share the screen here. Okay. Starting from the bottom, first thing here is the stack bomb, but I see that we have blocked here because we're waiting for the upstream. So I'm assuming we can just skip past that. I'm going to skip the draft and move on to support poetry in the Paketo Python build pack. Would anyone like to speak to this one?
My understanding is that this is already approved. Tim, I know, isn't here in the meeting, but I think the team's already started working on this. So I think it's kind of gotten a nod, but not like actually merged for whatever reason.
Not like a formal approval. It seems like it's missing the like GitHub approvals that we would need, right?
Yeah.
So maybe we can just nudge Python maintainers to.
I think that was part of the problem. I don't know who the current Python maintainers are right now, but it may only be, yeah, it's Tim and the Paketo reviewer bot. So it's that's a little bit tricky.
Right.
So he might not be able to merge it.
Yeah, he can't approve his own thing. Sounds like maybe we need another Python maintainer.
Rob Dimsdale is working to become a maintainer. He's working on this track of work. That's how he's gaining kind of contribution points.
That makes sense. I guess while we're in this state, do we want to have like a steering committee member pinch hit as a Python maintainer, like temporarily join and then leave or something like that?
I'd be happy to do that.
Just so we
I
can
think really, since
things.
It's just like, I think we can, as steering committee members, approve anything in this repo. So just don't even need to add ourselves to the teams. Just go ahead and like approve and merge. I can check in with Tim to just confirm that there's nothing else blocking this other than the technical merging.
Awesome.
For what it's worth, in the notes for last week, it says this is ready to merge.
Cool. Okay, so that's done. Moving on to RFC for secure runtime environments. Seems like there's been a lot of discussion on this one. And I know from my perspective, I'd love to see a couple more details in this RFC, but I do think that this is something that we should do. Something that we've done to a certain extent on Java already, just because we've run into situations where people are running in super lockdown environments where you can't write to the root file system anyhow. I think those errors might, come for the rest of Paketo eventually. But I'd love to hear counterpoints. Does anyone want to talk about this today? Does anyone feel like this is not a good idea? Okay, if we got nothing to say about it, we can move on.
I'm having a hard time thinking of what Paketo build packs outside of Java would be impacted by this change. That's like why I haven't really weighed in.
I think if the answer is very few, that's great. That's a great answer. The situations I can think of off the top of my head where something like this might be relevant are some use cases around using like exec D launch helpers, where you might have written some config file to the container, but then based on information that's provided at launch time, you want to write a new version of that file and pass it to the program. Like if your tool only takes configuration in a file and can't take it in an environment variable or something, you might quickly write a file and then start the program. So that's example 1. I think that's most of the Java examples. Example 2 would be some tool in your launch in your application is logging to a file, right? Like I think in general, we expect the application itself to be logging to standard out and standard error, but there might be some component that is relying on this logging to a file. Those are the 2 big ones I can think of.
I know that like PHP, I think ends up writing like an Nginx config to the working directory. I feel like maybe that happens at build time. I know that Nginx, I said Nginx or static file. One of them has basically like a runtime helper that at runtime will generate an Nginx config file. Or I think it actually is the Nginx Buildpacks. So like the Nginx Buildpack includes templated environment variables and other fields. And then at runtime, it like reads that template and then tries to write it out to the workspace. So it shouldn't do that. Instead, it should like write it to the temporary directory or something and then configure Nginx's start command, or the start command should be configured to read from like a location in the temporary directory rather than like its current workspace location. So there's just like some instances like that where when the app first boots, we're like writing some file or something before we start the process.
I think someone here also brought up like a couple cases where the apps are writing to the app directory, like when using something with SQLite. I forget who linked that example here, but I feel like to a certain extent we can't. I feel like if the app itself is doing it, it's kind of out of scope for this, where folks can then mount directories into the locations they want to write if they need to, because they write. I'm sort of okay leaving that as an exercise to the runtime user, unless, if we get a lot of complaints, we could create some mechanism where people are making things group writable explicitly by configuring the build packs to do that. Okay, seems like we're all on the same page about this one. We just need to work with Sam to get a couple more details in this proposal.
Yeah, I think the things that were asked for, and maybe I should leave another note, is, and unless it wasn't asked for, we're like a plan for like the steps of what we would do in any one of these individual things, like a list of known build packs that are violating the expectations here. And then I guess like some sort of way for us to confirm that the build packs actually continue to behave this way, whether that's like stacks that are test stacks that have a different CMB user for the run, so that they actually end up failing or something if they're doing something like writing to a non-writable location.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I noticed, I'll reach out to Dan too. He left some comments. Sorry, I meant to say this before I closed it, about like no suid and no exact and stuff like that being permissions on the temp directory. I honestly feel like that's a good thing. It's like the reason we want to write to very specific locations and not anywhere is for a security perspective. And I feel like the program should not, our build pack should not be writing something executable at the last minute. Okay, moving on to Buildpack YAML environment variables for PHP.
Yeah, this is mine. Dan and I have been going back and forth on changing a couple of these. The biggest highlights I would call out to anyone who read the previous iteration would be we've removed Redis and memcached environment variables in favor of having a set type name for service bindings that will have all of the stuff in them. So I think what I said was PHP Redis session and memcached or the PHP memcached session are both now the defined types for the service bindings. We also removed two Buildpack specific environment variables to lean on Composer native environment variables. So one of those being just the Composer environment variable, which allows you to indicate where a Composer configuration JSON is, and the other one is Composer vendor dir. That one is a bit more complicated because the Buildpack will still ultimately end up modifying that environment variable during the run, because we will need to do things for sort of efficient caching, but we are encouraging users to still use that as a setting. So y'all might want to go check those out. The only other large outstanding question that hasn't been directly sort of commented on in these comments is a discussion that Dan and I had in the original issue for this around potentially removing an environment variable to configure what web server you're running with, and instead using build plans and build configuration to do that. So if you wanted to run on Nginx, instead of setting an environment variable that was like this server, the web server used Nginx, instead just include Nginx at the top of the configuration or on top of the group order. I have very not strong opinions about whether or not this is actually how the PHP Buildpack functions. And I would like people who are more invested in the PHP Buildpack to weigh in on this, and I'm happy to add it. A comment in the thread is linked on the issue right there.
That's what we're looking at.
But yeah. Oh, I didn't link the exact comment, but it is in this issue thread.
I believe you.
Sorry. It's a bit of a back and forth. So I need just either a yay or a nay on this. I have right now the existence of a configuration environment variable, but I can also, it can be punted down the road, decided later. I don't have a lot of skin in that game. So someone who has more skin in that game should probably help me resolve this unresolved question. And then I think we're good to go.
Thanks for the update, Forrest. I will look at that specific question. I'll admit that I hadn't read this one very closely because I've not been so involved in the PHP things, but it seems like there's some interesting questions just about how much we want to conventionally use build plan versus environment variables, things like that are probably worth weighing in on. Okay, so everyone take a look at that. Proposal.
I think we skipped over the RFC to add an interface for removing shell specific interfaces. I think that one, unless I blacked out.
Thank you. No, my bad. I skipped that one entirely. Dan is bringing up a point about the dot profile thing. I feel like this is the kind of situation where we can introduce a build pack to make sure dot profile always works for folks. Someone else have concerns about moving to the direct processes? I don't know if this change is going to be made in C&B soon. Like we talked about this last week, and I came back to update here. I meant to put a link in here to the system build pack RFC that this is sort of blocked on. But I think we can make this change regardless, because I think it's a good change to make just in terms of how arguments are handled. It's already cleaner and the process start faster, and it will set us up to be in a good place for when the usage in launch toml does change.
In a good few of the build packs, we've been going around and kind of just making this change before this RFC merges. Like I think Sam did it for the Go build pack as like a proof of concept, and it's about to be changed in Node as well. So I think a lot of the non-Java build packs will be doing this regardless of approval.
So yeah, I think the Java build packs have already done this too. So it seems like we should find a way to approve this because we're doing it. Okay, proposal to alter builder order. Talked about this. It's about allowing apps that have front end code to detect as their sort of that have front end and back end be detected by the back end build pack instead of getting intercepted by the Node.js build pack. Frankie has made a request here that we try this out with the full builder. Is this against the samples?
Yeah, just because I initially did it with the base builder when the issue came in, as just like a gut check. And when I saw the UTOSN approval on here earlier, I just wanted to like flag that this hasn't really been validated for all the languages we support, which seems like important before we make this switch on people.
See if there's a big gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Just I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. We should try that out and throw the results of that on this as well. Seems like we can nudge Dan to do that. Cool. RFC for JavaScript front end support in web servers. This is an exciting one. You want to talk about this one, Ryan?
There's no change since last week on this one. I need to go back and fill out some more details in the RFC. I think that things that are outlined are totally reasonable requests. So yeah, I just need to find a moment to go and update this RFC with those details. The broad gist here is you've got this kind of class of front-end applications that are broadly referred to as Jamstack style applications. The idea being here, there's like some JavaScript stuff that runs on the front end in a browser, and it's talking to APIs on a back end. And so for this kind of application, if you're going to deploy it in a containerized environment, you basically would just have a bunch of static files, and then you'd have a web server just serving those static files so that your browser could download your CSS and your HTML and your JavaScript, and then that thing would end up talking to probably some other container that contains your backend. So the plan here was to enable us to pull in some build packs from the Node family, mostly those involved with kind of installing Node and installing all your dependencies, and then building, doing the build phase, turning your React app into just say some static JavaScript files, and then installing a web server like Nginx, and then getting that sent out as a container.
That all makes sense. Yeah. I feel like the use case makes a lot of sense. I think some of the questions Dan asked are interesting. Like, do folks expect that to be surprised that it's not sort of in the like Node.js build packs, even though they're not really using Node, they're like, oh, JavaScript versus web servers.
I kind of think that, to me, like the way that build packs are named is kind of about like what they put in the container. And so it wouldn't make any sense for the Node.js app to be the one that housed this, because Node doesn't actually end up in the container. It's just involved in the build process. So like, to me, the Node's Buildpack is about like you're running a node backend with a node process that's inside the container, then you want to use the node like Buildpack. This is like you just happen to be using Node to do this build phase. There's other frameworks, Hugo uses Go to effectively do the same process of converting some markdown and other such things into a static site. I think Jekyll is written in Ruby and accomplishes the same kind of thing. So like there's lots of stuff that's following this pattern that it isn't like Node.
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced by that. It's also like, we're going to start doing known asset compilation, like maybe, letting the Java build pack do that even, right? It's like that front end stuff is now kind of can happen in front of a variety of backends. And this is more about like single page applications that have a really minimalist static server on the back end. Okay, that sounds good. Is there anything that would help this move that we should talk about today? Or is this just like web server maintainers take another look?
This is just blocked on me, I think.
Cool. Credential configuration in Git Buildpack first. Yep,
this is a new RFC that I've just put forward about 6 days ago. If y'all haven't taken some time to look at it. The idea is to add some functionality to the Git Buildpack to allow users to configure credential sets through service bindings. So as it stands currently, if I wanted to do something, so the thing I'd be most familiar with is say like get a Go module that's private that would need Git credentials to fetch. Not really a great way of me configuring my credentials. So what this would allow is for users to attach their credentials via service binding and then have all of them loaded using a custom credential helper, which is something that Git supports. And then as far as I configure, that would help people load their credentials in for when they needed to access private modules from essentially any language package manager.
That makes a lot of sense. Does anyone have questions or things they want to talk about today regarding this RFC?
I actually have a quick question for you, Emily. I've been struggling to find some place where it's spec'd out that the entire build process for all of the build packs happen in the same container. The part of this is how this would be implemented would be that it loads into the global Git config for the container, the build container. And as far as I've been told by everyone in the CMB project, all of those builds for the build packs happen in the same container. So this would work just fine. And then the run container or these credentials are effectively removed insofar as you're just in a different container. But I can't actually find that spec'd out. So if you knew where I could maybe find that, that would be super helpful.
I think in the platform spec, it probably says that you run through the build stage of all the build packs in one container. Although this does lead me to a question. I don't think I was reading this carefully, but if you're talking about like, where does this file go, this global Git config file?
So it's in like home.gitconfig.
Is there any way to sort of just supply that file via a binding and leave it in the binding? I'm asking because in general, if you're giving something into a build pack as a secret, you're not supposed to write it to the root file system because that container file system is not treated in the same way that a secret would be.
Yeah.
So now you've taken the secret from somewhere secret to somewhere less secret.
I think that there's a bit more in a git config file that I wouldn't necessarily want to have a user upload every single time they wanted to upload credentials. And my original iteration in this RFC had some flaws in it that were in that realm of writing a credential to an actual global file. What we're actually writing to the file now is a helper, which all the helper will do is cat a file on the path where we tell it, and that file will be the path to the mounted volume that is the service binding.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. That's sort of exactly the concern I was about to raise, but you've already got that's what the helper's for. It already solves that problem. Cool. Thanks for explaining that.
Okay. I think the only thing that's just missing is approval from, or review and approval from utilities Buildpacks maintainers. And then beyond that, the implementation is pretty straightforward. So
Cool.
hoping for a fast turnaround on this.
I think that brings us up to date. So we've done our RFC review, which means I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can move on to the next agenda item, which is libcmb v2 updates and questions. I'm going to admit I don't know what the latest updates on that are. I think Dan's mostly been leading that effort lately.
The one thing I'll call out is that there is a meeting of the Buildpack authors sub-team this week, Friday, 10 a.m. Eastern. Yeah.
Be there, be square.
Yeah. I think that there's been some discussions with like parties outside of Heroku, Paketo. I think some Google folks have started coming in and weighing in on some other options, and so really excited. I'd love to try and keep the ball, or try and not keep momentum going, and also pick up momentum is what I'd love to do.
Up next is project update. Which project? Is this like a CMD project update, a Paketo project update?
Paketo in general. Although maybe a potentially interesting update to have here is the release of 0.13.3 lifecycle, which provides an upgrade path for Buildpack bill of materials. Can check that out. It will provide both the new file format and the original table to image labels format, if I recall correctly from release.
That is correct.
Let me throw that on those updates.
So feel free to try it out. Go ahead and move to the new API without losing the BOM on older platforms now. I think eventually the old BOM will be taken off new platforms, even if the Buildpack specifies it, but it should remain in place on old platforms, which is the goal here. Don't break old things. Up next, we have Buildpack logging to stream or not to stream. Tell us about this, Frankie.
Yeah, excuse me. So basically the other day I saw an issue come in where someone was just not knowing how to debug the .NET publish command because it was like hanging and they didn't understand why. So I sort of took a turn to see if I could improve the debuggability of the Buildpack by hopefully streaming out, excuse me, the output of the .NET publish command in like verbose logging mode, because currently the Buildpack doesn't show that output at all unless it fails at the end. And I did that because I figured, well, it's kind of nice that the logs are pretty quiet when everything works as expected, but clearly this is a situation where you just have no idea what's going on if you're not streaming the log output. And this kind of provoked a longer conversation on the PR that I hopefully linked, maybe. Yeah, so there ended up being some conversation on this draft pull request and also in a Slack channel in the Paketo org, I forget where, about whether this is actually the right thing to do. Namely, should Buildpacks as a rule just stream the output for all the commands that they run? Or should we be more selective about it, or some kind of middle ground? And it seemed like there were a few different opinions on this raised. And so I thought it would be a reasonable topic to bring up here, at least flagging it. The conversation could happen asynchronously on this pull request, I suppose.
It's an interesting conversation. I feel like we've had this conversation at some point in the past when we were talking about like stylistic differences between Java and other languages, right? Because I think the Java buildpacks have historically always streamed everything. And I think there are definitely pros and cons to both approaches. The cons being it can be very verbose, and if everything succeeds, maybe you don't want to see all of that. Pros being like if something's hanging, you can see that it's hanging, where it's hanging. You get a sense of progress if something's being very slow. So something much slower than you expect, it feels even more slow if you see nothing until it succeeds versus you see it happening. And then also, I think some tools are just verbose enough that you don't actually want to store all the logs in memory, then only print them if they fail, because you're filling up your memory with a bunch of logs. It's better just to stream it as it goes.
I guess something that I was wondering about for this was just like, so obviously, like Emily said, there's like a disparity between what the logs look like for Java versus like the other languages. And this is just like a question that you've brought up in Packet, which like the non-Java Buildpacks all use. Is it something that we need to discuss like in an RFC and like make a decision like Paketo Buildpacks wide, or is it acceptable for us to make a decision for Buildpacks that just use the Packet library and go from there? And then separately at some other point, if people want to, we can come up with a way like an RFC to like resolve disparities. I guess like the short way of saying that is like, is it okay for like Packet to make its own decisions and then we resolve like differences between Java and non-Java Buildpacks later? Or do you think we should try and resolve differences as we go?
I think one of the things that's been a major sticking point, and I guess it's why this is so hard to change now, is like Java Buildpacks did make a bunch of decisions about what they're going to log, and it's really hard to take those things back once you've done them. People start doing things that rely on that build output, and it effectively becomes some part of your public APIs. So it would be difficult for us to do something like make a decision for the non-Java Buildpacks to say, we're only going to do streaming of the log output if you say, you know, log level equals verbose, right? That's near, it wouldn't be really easy for Java to move in that direction, considering all their users today have an expectation that they can see, you know, 75,000 lines of output from Maven.
Makes them feel comfortable and safe.
Right. They would actually probably think something was massively wrong if it didn't just like, you know, completely explode their terminal when they built something. So like, how do we, I'd rather we like figure out on a case by case basis as we're introducing new features we want to support across, like what is that kind of baseline that we can do that would be something that's achievable for as far as consistency across all the language families.
I guess one of my questions would be like, how big of a problem is this outside of Maven? I would say like Maven's probably one of the most verbose tools in this department. And then even then you can change its logging level. Like would a compromise solution be stream the tool output, but configure the tool to be less verbose by default?
I think that that's an interesting idea. I know that when I think of other potentially gnarly looking stuff like NPM, not necessarily because its logging output is too much, but just because of the number of node modules that you can include in a build can skyrocket, and .NET Core can get hairy in its some of its build output. So I think that I don't know that I disagree with the idea of allowing people to set the verbose levels, but I think that gets really kind of annoying kind of quickly, depending on the kind of build you have. Like if as soon as I have to chain two commands together and I want to maybe just make them all quiet, that's where it gets difficult. And maybe that's a different scenario where we say it's all streaming, but maybe we also have quiet where we just dump those logs to a buffer
Stream them to
or
dev
something like
null.
that.
You know?
Yeah. It's an interesting idea, but it does kind of makes it such that we're just moving to what Java is doing, which I'm fine with. But I think it introduces back to the idea that Sophie had, which is in that case, then what we're doing is we're deciding as a project that the way that we deal with build tools is we stream their output unilaterally when at default log level, which I think is fine. But I think that we should just write that down somewhere that is more stone than the words that are coming out of my mouth at the current moment. And then that gets tricky, because then does that mean that we have to write a full blown like style guide for logging, which feels like a lot? Or do we just include it as like hey, when doing logging, this is what is expected of, standard output. Well, then what is expected of debug output? In debug output, do you have to set your tools output to also be whatever the equivalent debug level is? I think there's some complicated questions that need to be answered just by like this one move, unfortunately. And I don't know the best way of going about doing that.
Seems like some of the options for if we wanted to move in a more consistent direction. And I would say in general, our users benefit from consistency, even though it causes us pain as we have to negotiate between somebody making changes. Would be, it's either like a PR to the style guide would be the lighter weight place to start, or RFC is the heavier weight version, right?
For what it's worth, like some of this was hashed out when we did the logging level RFC, like, I don't know, 6 months ago. One of the things, like Forrest, what you brought up was actually is actually defined in that RFC, that setting the log level to debug does not change any of the settings of any of the tools that would have log output. If you want to modify their log output, you'd have to actually also configure their output to be in some debug mode using their environment variables or configuration files or what. So like those things are independent. The logging level that we have defined in that RFC only applies to the output that comes from the build pack itself, not from like tools the build pack happens to be streaming through to the output.
I also, this brings up something from bubbling up from the past that may have been answered, and I don't remember, which is the idea of users setting native configuration through environment variables, that those environment variables are overwritten as part of the build pack in an attempt to get it to certain states. So to like one of the things we do for Node, I believe, is set a different log level to be more production ready, whatever the hell that means, but it's what we do. And so I remember there being discussion at some point in the past about how we should or should not respect those environment variables. But if we wanted to introduce something like a native configuration like that, it would be something that we'd have to think about as well.
I think in those cases, we are setting it as default, meaning it will only apply if it's not set. So if the user had overridden that log level to be verbose, then it would be verbose instead of production or whatever we happen to have set it at. I think that was Frankie's RFC from back in the day about like respecting the user inputs for environment variables.
All right. There is an RFC up about it. All right. I need to take stock of the RFCs that we have written.
I think it does make sense to sort of treat the configuration of build pack log level and tool log level differently. Just when you think about how people are approaching these things, like when something goes wrong, like if you're a build pack author, you probably want the most verbose output out of the build pack itself when you're trying to debug your issue. And like maybe sometimes if you're a user and you think your issue is a build pack issue, you want that. But if you're just using build packs and you're pretty sure your issue is like your app and its build tool issue, you kind of want the build pack to get out of the way and you want to see as much out of your build tool as possible, right?
It's worth maybe considering that like we might want to go with an RFC that has more like kind of general rules. Like if your build pack runs a tool, then it's expected that the output of that tool is printed to standard out during the build phase for the build pack. However, don't go as deep as being like, it has to look like X, right? We can leave it up to the actual implementers to say, okay, how exactly do I want to achieve this? Because like the way I'd like to do it in Packet is certainly different than how it's currently achieved in the Java build packs.
I think that makes sense. We can start moving in a direction and we can keep it loose, like just put a bunch of shoulds, like, you know, if one user community really wants something for whatever reason, and we would probably give it to them, right?
I think shoulds are a good idea too, because we also sometimes utilize underlying tools to grab configuration for the build pack as well. Does the user need to see me running like Go commands to figure out what my like base binary is? I'd probably not, but
yeah, see, that's more like an implementation detail, but it's, if it's something a user would see if they were building locally, it might be something they would like to see in a build pack build because it makes them feel like I understand what's happening, you know.
For sure. But yeah, I like the idea of keeping it loose, but having something that's like, hey, these are kind of the expectations, and do what feels right.
Your general guidelines.
Yeah.
There will always be exceptions.
So I think what I'm hearing so far is that there's use in streaming the logs, but we want to avoid being overly prescriptive about log output because we don't want to back ourselves into a corner, basically, or undo choices that have already been made. So from that, I mean, if it's going to be an RFC that's just a bunch of shoulds, that just sounds like a change to the style guide, honestly, like friendly suggestions, which allows us time to bring build packs in line with the suggestion as well. So I can take the action of, I guess, like opening that pull request that distills the conversation we've had here.
Thanks, Frankie.
Yeah, for sure. And then I guess this now reopens the question of how exactly we would want to implement such a thing in Packet, but that's kind of a separate concern.
All right. I think that's all we have for today then, unless anyone has another conversation they want to bring up with our last 10 minutes. All right, then. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your
Bye.
day.